Now we wanted to start our panel on civil rights and criminal justice. We are running a little bit late, but so I apologize to our panelists and thank you so much for your patience. We have some amazing panelists for you today. One of my favorites is my community mom, Joanne, Executive Director of the American Federation. We also have Jared from the Brooklyn Defender Services, I believe, and then there's also Erin Lee George from Citizen Action of New York. I wanted to say thank you all for being here. I think that we might be expecting somebody from Bookable, but I think that we may have had a scheduling issue because of our delay. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. Some of the budget highlights that I think already kind of mentioned, but I wanted to kind of again, our panels are always shifting with the panels because of the issues that people care about. And I wanted to also, again, have my staff put in the budget cheat sheet for everyone so that you can follow along because it is very convoluted and we're very well known for our budget cheat sheet. So if we can make sure that folks have that and I'm just gonna go over a couple of the highlights of this year's budget and some of the things that shouldn't have been in there but were. And so in the fiscal year 2021 budget, measures were passed to remove guns from domestic abusers by authorizing police officers responding to a family offense to temporarily take custody of firearms under certain circumstances. The other thing is, additionally, the budget restores $4.2 million for assistance fund LSAF in support of civil and criminal legal services grants. Also, the fiscal year 2020-21 budget includes $4.2 million for the Legal Services Fund and $16.1 million for, I'm sorry, Nick, I'm gonna sorry, so, and $16.1 million for various legal services, including funding for the New York State Defenders Association, prisoners' legal services, and domestic violence-related civil and criminal legal service providers. This budget also expanded the list of crimes that are eligible for a judge to set cash bail, which includes manslaughter, aggravated vehicular assault, sex trafficking, money laundering for terrorism, and first-degree grand larceny. This budget removes guns from domestic abusers, prevents individuals who commit certain crimes in other states from legally attaining firearms, creates a new class of felony for domestic acts of terrorism motivated by hate, and allows judges to ban repeat sex offenders from mass transit for 3 years. I just wanted to specifically say for our district, there were a couple of things that we really care about, and that one of the biggest is that this year's budget rolls back hard-fought criminal justice reforms by extending the time for prosecutors to provide initial discovery to 20 days when the defendant is in custody and to 35 days when the defendant is not in custody. There are a couple of other things that we wanted to mention, but I'm going to leave that to our panelists, our distinguished panelists, and make sure that folks can get a word in. So I'm going to start with Joanne Niou, the ED of Asian American Federation. Joanne, can you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the things that were in this budget that you liked and certain things that you didn't like, and then the things that you feel like are hurtful to our communities regarding criminal justice reform?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Joanne Niou, Executive Director of the Asian American Federation. Thank you for inviting me. I went outside for a hot 5 minutes today to go to Staples to go pick up a printer, and I realized what a beautiful day it was and that we had spent the entire spring inside. But I'm also really grateful that I'm in a place where I'm safe, and it's great to see all of you. So, you know, I'm going to tell you that I don't have all the points of the specific points of the budget that I want to share, and where I agree with, where I disagree with. But I want to tell you what the challenges are in the community, and that is around immigration and legal services for the Asian American community. My God, I mean, how many years have I been saying this? There isn't a system available for our community to have easy access to affordable attorneys, and so the Asian American community continues to have, in New York City, it's the Indian, Chinese, and Bangladeshi community that has the highest rate of deportation. It's not the fact that, and then now we have public charge put in there. So people who are eligible now more than ever, people who need to go on public assistance, not because of immigration status, but they're fearful that, use of public benefits will jeopardize a green card or a citizenship. They're foregoing life-saving programs. So, we are seeing budget cuts everywhere, state and city. I mean, ultimately everybody I talk to in every forms of government, I'm realizing we're broke. We don't have money, and this is a reality. But I think the thing that we need to think about, and how do we work with our legislators and push our leaders, is, well, what is the priority? How are we going to prioritize what the essential programs are? I've been thinking a lot about, now we're heading into week 8, and I think a lot about, what kind of world do I want to see when we come out, right? And Yulene and I have talked about this. The fact that, this is pretty harsh, but all the essential workers worked, and all the people who were not essential workers stayed home, got to stay home and order stuff delivered to us, right? And so, as much as I always tell people, like, as much as there are times when I think, oh, you're doing really good work, and you're important. I speak for essential workers, but I'm not an essential worker. Those essential workers had to get up in the morning and go to work to put food on the table, and that was the reality. And I think what I think about in the budget, I think about how society looks at this. I mean, this is the first of many, many pandemics to come. This is not going to be something that is, a one-time deal. I think what we're really going to see is how, what we need to think about is, how do we really value the people who had to go to work? How do we really value the frontline workers? Because it's, and as I've been telling, everywhere I've been invited to speak, I keep saying, the new normal is going to be, everybody's going to rush out and they're going to do exactly what they did before, because that feels normal, right? Because we've all been stuck inside, but that cannot be the way it is. And this is an opportunity. It is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to really think about and do rebuilding society that really values the people who do the real jobs, the undocumented immigrant, the low-wage worker, the working class people who didn't get to access tests. Look at all the people who died. It's the communities of color, the Blacks and the Latinos. I heard Jennifer talk about, the Asian American small businesses. During the period of the Great Recession, we contributed 40% of the small businesses, but I don't think we got the help that we needed, certainly, because I know small businesses right now are planning to file bankruptcy. And that means, and they don't have the protections that big corporations do. We've got to turn this economy on its head. We need to figure out, how do we stop valuing, like this ivory tower, the white collar office, jobs. And, how do we stop to put that on the pedestal and really say, who helped me during the pandemic? The grocery workers, the garbage collectors, the food delivery workers. And I say that because, for 2.5 years, I fought to legalize e-bikes. And now, as soon as we got them legalized, they were getting tickets, $500 tickets at a pop, at least, 3 tickets a pop. And then, like a week before the pandemic hit, and we were told to be on lockdown, they're no longer, now they're deemed essential workers. It should not have taken a pandemic for us to say they are essential workers. They've always been essential workers. And you know what? I will tell you what enrages me is that some of the people who probably called and said, I don't want these people driving through my neighborhood, because as we know, most of the workers are Chinese and Latino men. People who complained about them probably benefited and ordered food from them. And so, I want to call hypocrisy out. And until we truly come out of this as better people who really recognize who kept the city alive and fed, and the gears moving while most of us had the privilege of staying home, I think we need to we have to have some, I think this is our proverbial come to Jesus moment, right? And how we deal with this, and how we embrace this reality, I think is going to speak volumes about who we are. So.
Thank you so much. You just like, oh, everything that you said, Joanne, obviously is like close to heart and home. I mean, I'm hearing stories of folks who are delivery workers and no PPEs were provided by, you know, any of the folks who they work for. Obviously, Caviar is not out there holding out like PPEs for folks, and you know, they're even charging them extra. They're taking their tips, you know, and it's just like some crazy stories that you're hearing out there. And on top of that, I had a couple of Asian American delivery workers who told me some really severely harsh racist stories of folks who didn't want an Asian American delivering to their home. One guy even spat into the eye of one of our workers. I just felt like that was disgusting and like just horrible. And, you know, as the district that, you know, faced 9/11, Sandy, and on top of that, you know, the first to get hit by the racism of COVID, I wanted to say that, you know, we are always out there like at 7 o'clock applauding our essential workers. After 9/11, we appreciate all of our first responders, blah, blah, blah. But like we don't actually consider, we constantly forget after, you know, like afterwards. And we constantly forget to, you know, consider all of the things within policy and all of the things within our government budget that should be protecting our workers and should be protecting people. Because right now, even as you're seeing the statistics of like, you know, I heard a really incredible presentation actually by some NYU students, but it was, you know, the fact that certain folks with certain level of college degree or no college degree, et cetera, like you can literally tell, you know, who was going to actually get infected and who wasn't. Like it was crazy, the statistics and the way that people just ignore the facts that, you know, folks don't even have hazard pay. People are not getting, you know, healthcare. People, you know, the folks who are taking the most risks have the least protections in our system, and that's just the end all. And I just wanted to say thank you again, Joanne, because, you know, I'm going to come back to you in a bit to talk about the Liberty Defense Fund and what we funded and how Asian Americans have gotten $0 from it before, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to hit up and also introduce the fact that Youngmi is here, and so is Nick from Vocal. So Youngmi's actually from Brooklyn Defender Services as well, but we didn't get to see her earlier, so I'm sorry I didn't get to say that you were on the panel as well. And Nick has just joined us from Vocal. And so I know that we have a couple of questions here today about some of the things that had happened in our budget. And so I'm just gonna start off with, I think I'm gonna start off with Youngmi because I think that, you know, folks really want to talk about some of the things that have changed regarding bail reform. And so if you can just kick that off, because we have a question here that says, what are some of your concerns and for your organizations that you have heard about with the new bail reform, and are they valid? And then if there are things that changed, isn't that good? So if you can answer that for us, thank you.
So hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this town hall. It's a complicated question. The reason why we needed bail reform in New York State is very obvious. We had racial imbalance and inequities. It wasn't just about money. And the numbers were significant when you looked at the race population in jails throughout the state, not just New York City. And there was a real need to level the playing field for everyone, not just in terms of bail, but also discovery. Discovery applied to everyone, where the prosecutors had total control over the information that no one else had access to. It's very difficult to defend a case, even when you're innocent, when you don't have that kind of information, where you don't even know what you're defending against. So we had a great new bail reform law, discovery, starting in January of 2020. And of course, because it's very politicized and because there is, I hate to say it, sort of a racism factor going on out there. There was a lot of fear mongering, a huge fear mongering campaign, especially when it came to bail reforms. And of course, unfortunately, there were some capitulations made, and we have more people who are now eligible for bail should they get charged with a crime, more non-violent felony charges that are also eligible for bail. And anytime you increase these sort of money bail buckets, of course you're going to get more incarceration, which defeats the purpose of having bail reform. So yes, we are very concerned about that. I think one thing about this COVID crisis is when we're looking at resources and how under served and how the poor really have no voice and they're not receiving services, this COVID crisis really highlights the lack of services where people don't have places to live that are safe. Some judges think that it's okay to keep people at Rikers Island without a true understanding that when you're there, there's no ability to maintain social distancing. People are calling us, they're terrified from jail every day. There's a lack of soap. People can't definitely stay 6 feet away from each other. And so it's just, it's pretty appalling that in the midst of this crisis, we have now more people who are eligible for detention, and with the governor's executive order, we're not even getting sort of the due process protections, such as the right to a grand jury indictment, or even what's called a preliminary hearing, where a judge has to find probable cause if a case is going to continue, or if you're going to remain detained on a felony and for some misdemeanors as well. So yes, we're very worried, not just for the long term, but especially now when we have this crisis going on, and it's really, really bad at Rikers Island.
So thank you so much, Youngmi. I'm gonna go to Jared next, or was it Aaron? Aaron, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. I think the four of us have spent a lot of time working on this issue over the last few years, so I think can kind of go with flow. So thank you for inviting me today. For folks on the call, I work for Citizen Action. We're a statewide grassroots organization with 8 chapters and affiliates across the state, and we work to advance racial justice and socioeconomic justice through legislative work, electoral work at the local and the state level. I think one of the most disturbing pieces about the bail and discovery law rollbacks that were included in the budget is related to the process. I think it's really important to name that bail reform was working, right? The goal of bail reform was to reduce mass jailing across the state. The goal of discovery reform was to make sure that people had information about the case that was going to be brought against them, instead of being blindfolded to case evidence and then coerced into plea deals. In New York State, 99% of cases resolved through a plea deal. And if you don't have the discovery information, right, you're making a decision based upon the fear of what the prosecutor is telling you, like these charges carry a sentence of 25 years, but I'm going to give you 8. And the difference there sounds so terrifying that people will plead to charges they've not committed. They'll plead to higher charges. And so, these laws were working. And, despite all of the fear mongering and disinformation that was being spread through the media, through, a coordinated, well-funded opposition campaign driven by law enforcement, prosecutors, the very people who have a vested interest in maintaining their power in the system, in maintaining the status quo, crime was not going up. People were returning to court. And, we saw statewide a 30% decrease in jail incarceration overall. On any given day, there's almost 7,000 fewer people legally innocent people who are in jail right now. And, you know, as Youngmi mentioned, that's important. It's important to reduce incarceration on any day. And it really became a critical public health protection, the bail reform law in the face of COVID-19, where thousands of fewer people cycling in and out of jails every single day, right? And so I think, you know, the decision to roll back bail was not to roll back the bail reform law, to roll back the discovery reform law. And, you know, I'm really grateful to Assemblymember Niou and the many other Assembly members and senators who really fought for justice and fought for policy rooted in fact and policy rooted in advancing solutions that actually address the root causes of harm. But the rollbacks were the result of politics, not data, not facts. Almost every media article that we saw that attributed something, everything under the sun to bail reform actually was not the result of the bail reform law. And I think, you know, something that I think is really important for us to think about and move from societally is that, you know, bail reform really represented and continues to represent the opportunity to shift our investment away from incarceration and criminalization, and focus on funding the services and programs that bring stability to people's lives, right? Like jails have for far too long been used as a social safety net to hide away issues of lack of investment in affordable, sufficient housing, lack of access to sufficient education, and lack of access to employment, you know, all of these social issues that we're seeing in stark relief in this moment with COVID-19, but which exist always. And to not hide away like racialized lack of access, which is what we know happens here. So, you know, I think that our concerns are valid. We have the whole history of the criminal legal system shows us that as much latitude as judges, prosecutors, law enforcement have to criminalize and incarcerate, they tend to use. But that doesn't mean that we can't fight at the local level and fight for accountability, because this law doesn't require them to incarcerate people. It doesn't require them to jail people or set bail. So I think there's still opportunity that's really important.
I'm going to go to Nick now just to introduce himself and then talk a little bit about some of the changes in bail and some of the things that also, I know that this is another fight, but we had a question earlier about, why is it that public financing of campaigns is so important? And I know that Nick also can talk to that a little bit, so.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I really enjoy, I forget, but when I enjoy hopping on a little early and hearing from Ricky and Annie and Jane about some of the economic pieces, because often we look at issues about criminal justice and civil rights as somehow separate from the rest of the world and the other systems that people are trying to navigate. And I think, as Joanne said, particularly in this time of recovery from COVID, all of these systems and really the failure of these systems are coming into really stark relief in a way that maybe they haven't before. So thank you again for having me. I really enjoy being involved in these conversations. But my name is Nick Encolada-Malinowski. I'm a Civil Rights Campaign Director at Vocal New York. Vocal is a grassroots membership-based organization. We work, we do organizing and policy work in 4 main areas: ending mass incarceration, ending homelessness, ending the war on drugs, and ending the epidemic of HIV and AIDS. We do most of that work statewide. Our office is in New York City, but we have organizers both in Western New York and the Capital Region. And then we also do direct services here in New York City for people who use drugs. And during the shutdown and pause from COVID-19, our direct services have actually been considered essential services. So that's really the core of our work that really has been on the front lines, so to speak, continuing to work with our participants who are by and large street homeless drug users who are finding all of their their lives completely upended by all of this, right? Places that people go to get food, people go to get shelter, places people go to shower, to use a bathroom, right? All of these resources have been shut down. So yeah, just real shout out to everybody who is addressing this stuff on the front end. In terms of the budget, our civil rights work really did focus on bail and discovery. I don't want to repeat what other folks have said, but we're also very disappointed with the outcome. It is, again, to go back to the way that these issues are intersecting with each other, there was this narrative that was put forward that somehow the bail law by itself was supposed to be either protecting public safety or creating some sort of absence for public safety. And that is, I think, the piece that we need to continue to address going forward, because the reality is that no law can provide that, right? That every law, but specifically with laws relating to criminal justice, there is so much discretion in the system, but for police, for prosecutors, for judges. Every county in New York State has a different jail population, and that's really a result of the local politics and resources that they have in that county. And so as we review sort of the bad things that happened in the budget, one of them is bail, but the other piece of it is that we just saw huge cuts to funding for healthcare, for housing, for all of these other things that we know and our members know is what actually provides security and public safety for people. And so what we're looking at now in New York City, for example, is our homeless members, right, trying to avoid COVID, leaving the shelter, which is an unsafe, is supposedly a government intervention, but is one that is unsafe for them, going onto the subway and then getting arrested and having an interaction with the police, which is going to end up being the most unsafe part of their day. And so I think, the budget is one piece of this, but that we really need to look at, and as Joanne said, like, opportunity is probably the wrong word, but like coming out of this crisis, we do have possibly an opportunity to really reevaluate and look at the way that we structure society, and that if we do focus on the people who are the most marginalized, that the solutions that come out of that sort of inquiry is going to help everybody and is going to get us to the place where we do have the most safety and the most security for everybody in society.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. And last but not least, there's Jared, who has to speak a little bit about his work as a public defender, and also some of the things that you guys are seeing on the ground.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member, and thanks also for having me. I also appreciate this conversation. So I'm actually not an attorney at Brooklyn Defender Services, but I do work around all these policy issues. And Brooklyn Defender Services, or BDS, represents people sort of at the intersection of a lot of the different injustices that we've talked about today. People who are accused of crimes, they're in criminal court, represents people facing deportation, who are detained and facing deportation by ICE, people who are facing the loss of their children to ACS, as well as people facing the loss of public benefits or housing, people facing eviction. And often we see, to Nick's point, how all these systems interact, and how often it's one person or one family facing sort of the full weight of the government policies against them across these different court systems and sort of different issue areas. And sort of to that end, I think, I don't want to repeat what's been said, but I think, there's also, from our perspective, some disappointment in the outcome on the budget. But I do want to just zoom out and to put a finer point on it, that, we're in this terrible moment. It's, the weight of the tragedy it's almost, it's hard to put it into words. There have been over 18,000 deaths in New York City alone, right? I mean, so many of us have loved ones, people we care about outside of the city and around the world, and that we're worried about. these are these are rates far higher than the harm caused, than the rates of death caused in by crime, even in some of the toughest years in this city. And I think it's an it's a moment where we are sort of forced to reevaluate how we define community safety and what keeps us safe. We know that even in this moment where the government, local, state, and maybe to a lesser extent the feds are marshaling resources to try to tackle this pandemic, that we're still so far behind the 8 ball here. And look at just state prisons. They've less than 1% of people in state prisons have been tested for COVID-19, even as we know that social distancing is impossible in these facilities and that outbreaks are spreading there. So when we look at budgets as moral documents and fiscal documents as opportunities for investments in what actually brings real community safety, I think there's a missed opportunity here. We were, as at Brooklyn Defender Services, we certainly advocate for indigent legal services funding. Our expertise is not so much in healthcare and education, but other panelists before us and coming on soon, I think, have spoken well about, or will speak about, what those what is really needed to fund those resources. And instead of that, the state took the step of rolling back some criminal justice reforms as they were working remarkably well. There was another opportunity, as was mentioned on the last panel, about or to help meet some people's needs with new community investments through the legalization of cannabis and reinvestment of revenue in the communities that have been targeted under prohibition. That was another missed opportunity. So again, I want to echo what Erin said, as Member Niou, and many of your colleagues, many of her colleagues were incredibly powerful and consistent in resisting some of the rollbacks to criminal justice reform, and also in demanding some of the investments that really bring about community safety. And also to Nick's point that the fight has to continue inside and outside of budgets, that there's nothing in the law that requires anyone to be in jail pre-trial where they're presumed innocent, and in fact, under even the old law, there is technically a prohibition on people being in jail simply because they can't afford bail, and that is only strengthened now under the new laws. So even as we're disappointed in the rollbacks, that we absolutely have to continue to come together and fight for our communities and fight for freedom.
Thank you so much, Jared. I also wanted to bring up some of the questions that we've gotten from folks. This one's a little bit more specific. Police officers will be able to take temporary custody of firearms in domestic violence cases. As a domestic violence survivor, I think it's really important that we keep people safe. But will this custody exist until everyone is safe? And if it lasts longer, is there a danger for a so-called violation of your Second Amendment rights?
So I can take that question on. Even before we had the bail reform laws that went into effect in January, judges always had the power and the authority to prohibit someone from owning, possessing a firearm or any dangerous weapon through the use of an order of protection. And if a final order of protection was entered, and depending on whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony, which is those orders of protection can last for years, that final order of protection could also prohibit the possession of a weapon, including a firearm. So there weren't really any constitutional challenges. I can say that in New York City, most people do not have a permit to carry a firearm. So they're prohibited anyway for anyone, for most people, unless you're an off-duty police officer or a retired police officer, or there are a few who I guess are where exceptions are made. So it's something that's always been in effect for a while. The new amendments don't change that as well. I think you're on mute.
I am. Thank you. Good catch. So one more question that we got from somebody who wrote in ahead of time is the 20-day period versus the 35-day period for initial discovery crafted on purpose to favor that the defendants be released? It seems like prosecutors would almost welcome the extra 15-day period.
Actually, that was not done in conjunction with bail to try to get people released. It was actually done to alleviate prosecutors' concerns that they didn't have enough time to produce discovery. So I will tell you that even though there had been a backlog of cases that had started in 2019, starting in January of 2020, when the new 15-day time period went into effect, for the most part, with the new cases, the DAs were able to get a big bulk of that discovery to us, the defense attorneys, within the 15-day time period. So regardless of whether one was incarcerated or not. So it was doable, but there was a real concern about from the DAs and law enforcement that they couldn't do it. And so they bifurcated it to try to ease the time period. And even if the DAs weren't able to make that 15-day time period, it wasn't as if they were going to receive huge sanctions. So it wasn't done to try to get people out of jail necessarily.
Just to make sure evidence was shared. Yeah.
Yes.
And so this one is probably citizen action and vocal. Why is public financing of campaigns important? I know I asked it a little bit earlier. We didn't really get to it.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think sort of the just basic answer is public financing of campaigns is critical because we have to remove the influence of big money and well-funded special interests from politics. And increase the power of small donations. You know, we see the ways that you know, big money plays out in politics, and well-funded entities that that donate to various electoral campaigns have influence over the ways that the policies that affect all of our lives play out, right? We know that sheriffs, law enforcement give an enormous amount of money to various legislators across the state. And we know that that has influence on the decisions that various electeds make. You know, I think it's also really critical to have publicly financed elections or publicly financed campaigns because it gives everyday people the means to run for office, right, and represent their communities. While relying on small donations from constituents instead of having to seek large checks that then create special interest control over or influence over decision making. So it's sort of twofold, right? Is removing that influence of big money, but then also creating a system wherein everyday New Yorkers can run viable campaigns to get elected. You know, and I think that there's, you know, there are many electeds, including Assemblymember Niou, who have taken this mantle up in their own campaigns and elections and refused to accept money from, you know, refused to accept big money, special interest money from entities that create harm in our communities and to drive forward their elections and their campaigns by relying on small donations. And I think it's important because that also makes those folks accountable to their constituents. We did in this budget get some loose, you know, it's sort of a loose, weak public financing system that is also something to build on. So there has been some progress. It's not sufficient by any means, but I think that there is momentum and energy to build upon that. Nick, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. That was pretty comprehensive. But the one thing I would add is, right, the reason that we want everyday people from our communities running for office. One, it's just good for democracy, for anybody who wants to run to be able to run. But there's also a level of accountability that comes from people who are actually representing the needs of their community in the legislature. That is super important. And again, as we look at what the COVID-19 recovery looks like, it's going to be critical. Like we've seen, for example, the bailouts from the federal government. You've seen embassy suites and the Ritz-Carlton getting millions of dollars of bailouts. That is because the majority of elected officials of the federal government are not accountable to their actual constituents, and they're accountable to their donors and wealthy people. And the same is true in the state of New York. For us to recover in a meaningful way, we need our representatives to be actually representing the issues of the people that live in their districts and bringing those issues to Albany and fixing them. And the only way that we can ensure that that happens is if we do not have people winning elections bankrolled by the real estate industry or other, as Aaron said, big money interests. So super important issue.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I also had to go back to Joanne Niou because the Liberty Defense Fund, something that we actually did fund partially in the budget, and wanted to make sure that we covered some of that as well, because we know that it's also very disparately doled out. So please, Joanne.
So a couple years ago, when the Liberty Defense Fund was rolled out, we got a grant which we shared with 10 community groups. And it was taking into account the major communities, the Asian communities, the language, the potential immigration actions that were coming down the pike, like, TPS, for instance. So that project became, it was the first time ever that we, engaged in something that big that has to do with immigration. But it got reformatted. And so I think a few groups had gotten that grant. But I think, what it does with grants like that, where, few groups get it instead of like a collective, is that it pits people against each other, especially by government that doesn't often recognize the diversity of populations. We are diverse by language, culture, religion, anything you can think of, immigration history. And, as a Census Information Center, my research and policy director reminds me that a good chunk of our community, this is the first time they're doing the census. They are new arrivals since the last census. So, we have a lot of newcomers, and people need to know what their rights are as immigrants. And I talked about public charge before that, with this unprecedented unemployment, people are going to need to know what their rights are. And so we're going to need to build up expertise. We need to build up the foundation. And I think this is where, we're during a pandemic, during when you really need that system to work, is exactly what everybody's been saying, is where you see the fact that we don't have a system, and this is where we're cracking. People are panicking. People, my question, all the time is, if people are disenrolling, where are they getting help? Because I know that some of the big food programs have gotten millions of dollars already. My community doesn't access that. And my communities are some of the poorest New Yorkers. So in every way, not just immigration, but in every way, the Asian American community, I've always been so frustrated about how government sees the Asian American community, but I've been very vocal that this crisis has shown that Asian Americans are not even second-class citizens. We're third-class citizens, because since January, when the hate crimes started happening, there was no help from law enforcement, and I had been asking for that help. And so everybody takes their own sweet time to support our community. My biggest fear has been, what happens when essential workers go on the subway and, they're targets, they're victims of hate crimes. That's a real question. Certainly, this is an opportunity to build collaborations between communities of color. We're actually working on a program to do that, because this can't be like communities of color, couple communities of color versus the Asians, because that's not how it's going down. I think this really, like I said, like every weakness that we've had as a society, this has, this has put the spotlight. And, I really appreciate the conversations that Aaron and Jared and Nick have talked about with all the campaign finance, right? Like the money in politics. But the other thing is, you can put all the money in there, but like, unless people go out to vote, it doesn't mean a damn thing how much money you have, because this is ultimately what it is. If you don't go out to vote, nobody's going to care about your community. And this is, I know the Asian American community has one of the lowest votes, lowest, voting power, because people are there's always some excuse, right? And, but the reality is that that's probably the single most powerful act. If they know that your community is paying attention and you're going to show up, like literally I've been saying, like, I'll come out and vote for the dog catcher, right? Because it means that it's one vote that is critical to lending my voice to my community. So I think this is exactly, besides the money conversation, it's also the actions of the community. And the one wish that I have for the Asian American community is the realization that, we have been suffering for a really long time. This COVID thing hit our shores, in January, and the Asian American community from the get-go started suffering, and there wasn't any help. And everybody said, hey, we're going to get around to it. Like nobody, we've been asking for help, pleading, my God. I mean, like, how many more, public education, news media things that I have to do to say the Asian American community is suffering, and there wasn't any help until it hit the mainstream community. So I know for a fact that Asian American community, we don't, it's harsh for me to say, but, I want people to prove me wrong, because the numbers bear out. And the other challenge is that, there are a lot of things that we could be frustrated with the governor and the mayor. The reality is that they've never done a pandemic before. So in my own way, maybe it's because it's Sunday and I'm supposed to, I didn't go to church Sunday, but maybe it's because it's Sunday, but they've never done a pandemic before. So I want to not be like hypercritical. Like I want to say, like, you guys were terrible, you did horrible things, because no, right? Like they've never done this before. So I get that. But how we spend the rest of the dollars is going to really matter. And for all the budget conversations, it's also how the community will respond. They cannot go back to sitting back and saying, oh, it's a pain in the neck for me to go register to vote, so I'm not going to do it. After all that how we've been treated, if people are not sitting at home for 8 weeks and processing what this means, that's going to be a damn shame. And it's a wasted opportunity. And I also want to say hello I see Carlina, but I also see Jason. So I want to say, Jason, it's so great to see you. Mwah!
I wanted to say, thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you so much for the other panelists. We have 2 other electeds who joined us, and I also want to give props to my very good friend, Jason Starr. Jason was supposed to actually join this panel, but we kind of had some time mix up because we had to shift from Friday to Sunday, etc. So Jason, do you want to say a couple of words on bail and on civil rights? So civil rights and criminal justice reform.
Sure. I don't think that I can probably, I don't think there's anything to be said that my colleagues here haven't said. But I will say that by way of introduction, my name is Jason Starr, and I think relevant for folks here today is I spent 3 years as counsel to Governor Cuomo for civil rights and federal affairs from 2017 until September of last year. So it's good to be here. And I'll just say one thing that maybe wasn't touched upon, which is the importance, I think, of everyone in this moment to remember that, the executive still retains a significant amount of power in terms of clemency to really respond. What happened with regard to the rollbacks of bail reform are definitely unfortunate. And I think they set up, more mobilization, more fights to come in the future. But right now, with what's going on in jails and prisons, we just have a responsibility. And you have someone sitting in a position that by the stroke of a pen can really change folks' lives, but also, change the trajectory of this public health crisis in a really meaningful way for people who don't have voices. He's shown political courage and willingness to do that before, but in my humble opinion, he needs to do a lot more. And I feel like the pump is primed. And so I would just sort of also encourage all of us to remember that there are a lot of people who need our voices and need us to advocate on their behalf, to him to make that, a reality. He's on TV every day. He has a national audience. He's executing a national press strategy. So he should be executing national leadership on how to respond and use all of the tools in the toolkit to help New Yorkers, all New Yorkers, weather this crisis in a way that I know we can.
Thank you, Jason. That was such a good way to close. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the power and those words, and for this whole entire panel for bringing awareness to folks about, some of the changes and some of the things that still haven't been done, and some of the things that we need to do better to basically dismantle and redesign a system that is working exactly the way that it was designed to hurt particular communities. So wanted to say thank you again to Joanne Niou, especially on the civil rights stuff that we've been working on together. And she's just an incredible advocate, especially for our AAPI community. So thank you so much.